Welcome to Artificiality. This podcast is brought to you by the Artificiality Institute, a nonprofit research organization shaping the human experience in a world of synthetic intelligence. We explore how humans and AI co-evolve through research, design, education, and dialogue, so our future with AI is more meaningful, not just more efficient. You can learn more about the Institute at artificialityinstitute.org. Please consider subscribing to our newsletter to get all of our content delivered to your inbox, and please consider donating to support our work. Our impact depends on the generous support of people like you. Welcome back to Artificiality, where we explore the human experience of AI. In this episode, we're excited to have Eric Schwitzgebel with us, a professor of philosophy at the University of California at Riverside. Eric will be joining us at the Artificiality Summit in October in Bend, Oregon. You can check out more about that at artificialityinstitute.org/summit. And please also, if you enjoy our work, please subscribe to get all of our written and podcast works in your email. Now, Eric, we've had Eric on the podcast today to talk about his book, The Weirdness of the World, which is a fantastic book. And as I say at the very end, in case you don't stick around, it is highly readable, which if you've studied philosophy like I did in college, you stumbled across some philosophers that you thought were a little bit difficult to get through. This is definitely not one of them. And it doesn't mean that the ideas aren't more challenging, mind-opening, exploratory. It is really an interesting book. In this episode, we talk with him about weirdness and why that's interesting and wonderful. We talk about consciousness. We talk about consciousness possibilities with AI and the sort of moral conundrum that these things present.
We also talk about dogs, cats, rabbits, broccoli, stones, all sorts of things, as well as AI. Eric's just such a broad thinker on this topic, and so much of he also talks about the philosophy of opening versus the philosophy of closing. And This is very much an opening kind of conversation where we're exploring these different possibilities and what they might mean, and not trying to pre-close things. So all three of us shared the same degree of skepticism over certain things to do with the current way instantiation mental models for what AI is going to do and where it's going to be. And overall, I left hopeful that humans are still pretty cool.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think I left hopeful that there's still other people like us thinking about the way that we might do this differently. You know, that there isn't.
Doesn't have to be the way it is.
This isn't inevitable and it isn't pre-described. And there might be other ways of approaching AI when you ask the right questions. And Eric does a beautiful job of asking great questions. And when you keep
bringing the right people in, that diversity of thought and diversity of approach and diversity of life experience and diversity of consciousness is actually the most important thing. So it was a terrific conversation.
Yes. Well, I hope you enjoy it as much as we did, because we certainly thoroughly enjoyed the conversation with Eric, and we're looking forward to being able to have a deeper conversation with him in person in just a couple of months. So without further ado,
at the summit.
Please enjoy our conversation with Eric. Thank you very much. Eric, thanks so much for joining us. We're quite excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So I would love to start with our sort of standard opening question for you, which is, what inspired you to write this book? And I think it's because I found it so interesting that I'm really interested to figure out what inspired you to write this one.
Well, I guess I have been doing a series of papers going back to about 2012 that were unified by the idea that by my love of the kind of weird implications of some philosophical views and the plausibility of views and positions that people find bizarre. And so I thought it would be nice to kind of collect those ideas together into a book that generalizes and celebrates the bizarreness of the world as revealed by philosophical and cosmological thinking.
That's awesome. I do love it. I mean, I think that we both love the bizarre and the weird. And so I give credit to Helen when she showed up and said, you got to check out this book. I was like, that's exciting.
Well, and also one of the things I loved about it is that, weird is a word that has this fabulous plasticity. It can be used in so many different ways. And, whether it's keep Portland weird, which is kind of now how I think little weird. But then when I read your book, it's like, oh no, really weird. Like weird is something to actually not just sort of strive for in a preservation sense, but weirdness is something to actually invite and it's almost like when Thomas Kuhn said, you've got to think about an anomaly as the start of your scientific pursuit, that weirdness is the start of a philosophical pursuit. And I particularly like that framing.
Yeah, I think it often is, maybe not always, but probably often you're struck by something that is difficult to explain, difficult to understand, and that's what launches you into thinking philosophically about an issue. So, consciousness is, of course, the great example. It seems kind of strange that if it's true, that, material things bumping against each other could somehow give rise to all of this experientiality that we have. And basically every philosopher's attempted answer to this puzzle ends up entangling you in a wide variety, a diversity of weirdness, and different views have different kinds of weirdnesses to them.
So let's bring it through to the audience and the viewer at the moment. Maybe jump into the sort of first part of the book. I think it's one of the best chapters. I love it because it's just really starts to entangle you with all of these different conundrums about the United States being conscious. Because it feels to me that one, if you walk us through that journey, but that interconnectedness, and the story about the interconnectedness and the processing of just the way that you've thought about it it's such a good analogy to how we might start thinking even now about AI. It's a nice entry point from an AI perspective is what I found.
Right. So most of us think the United States is not a conscious entity, right? And here by the United States, I mean the concrete entity that has people as its parts. I don't mean like the government or the social structures or something like that. I mean, just like think about a spatially dispersed entity that contains people, kind of like you contain cells, right? So think about that thing. And does it have some stream of experience over and above the experiences of the individual constituents, kind of like you presumably have a stream of experience over and above what's ever going on with your individual neurons or the individual cells in your body? So normally I think we tend to assume that's not the case if we think of it as a possibility at all, which of course most of us don't. And the thought that I had behind the paper that I wrote on that, which eventually became this chapter in the appendix and is important in the book, is that if you think about standard scientific materialist views, and also a lot of non-materialist views, but most kind of naturalistic approaches to consciousness that are out there in the world, the kinds of traits that they think are responsible for indicators of being conscious in an animal, the United States has those things too, right? So massive internal information connectedness. Right, your brain has got all this information swirling around in complex patterns. Well, of course, the United States has lots of information swirling around in complex patterns within and between people also. Or if you think about something like complex, sophisticated responsiveness to its environment, right? So the United States, it does things collectively like import bananas, right? And it imports bananas from the places that have the lowest prices. So it's showing some sensitivity to economics. As a group, it can form armies that then go invade other countries. And those armies, they don't crash into mountains, right? They go around them and they discover Osama bin Laden or whatever, right? So it seems to be engaging in kind of sensory activities, right? It monitors space for asteroids that might hit Earth and prepare to attempt to deflect them, right? So there are various things that happen. It regulates its smoggy exhalations. It also monitors itself, right? Another thing that is thought often to be central to consciousness in humans and maybe other animals is some kind of capacity for self-representation or self-monitoring or knowing what's going on with you internally. The United States does that too, right? Of course, the United States keeps track of its population, knows who is president, knows who's about to become president, monitors how many bananas are coming in, distributed across the entity, all kinds of things like that, right? So if you kind of look at, in a broad brush way, at the kinds of things that standard scientific materialists say, these are the kinds of things such that when you see them in an animal, it looks like it's conscious. Well, the United States has those things too. It's even got a whole bunch of neurons, right? They're encased in our individual heads. And it's got lots of neurons. Seems to be some sort of living entity with a history and biological groundedness in the world, right? So on these grounds, you might think, okay, well, look, if we just apply our standard scientific theories of consciousness out of the box without kind of noodling them around, right? It seems like maybe the United States would qualify as a conscious entity. And is there some reason to think that's absurd? I mean, it's strange, it's weird, it's contrary to how we ordinarily think about things, but there's some piece of knowledge we have such that we can say, oh yeah, because we know this couldn't be conscious. And I don't think we have that kind of grounds for confidence that it's not conscious. So that's kind of the fundamental thought. And then a lot of what I do in the chapter is kind of talk about possible objections and why those various objections don't work. Because whenever I float this by people, they're like, well, here's my objection. And for basically all of these objections, the ones that I've received so far, I've thought through them in various ways and have responses, and I share the responses.
I will say that my experience is the same as when I brought up this concept with other people. It's you do get a very quick answer of that someone feels that they've broken the idea, even though they've just started to think of it. So I'm sure you've had a lot of those. I find it fascinating because actually, when I read that section, it reminded me of sort of a mind-opening moment when I started to absorb Michael Levin's work in synthetic biology and his world of thinking. And he uses this phrase that I believe it's him. You have to correct me if I got it right. He talks about the bag of cells, right? Like we're a big bag of cells, because he's talking about what's happening at a cellular level. And, sort of there's this, I don't want to oversimplify because I will oversimplify because I'm not Michael, but the ability for the intelligence to be at a very low level, in a system, that there's lots of intelligent things happening within this whole bag of cells. And so the idea that this bag of cells is the only thing that can be intelligence is just sort of, it's somewhere between a false premise and absurd, at least the way I've absorbed it. And when I've absorbed his work, and so I read yours, I sort of had the same sort of idea of like, well, of course, right? Why wouldn't there be an ability for if consciousness is in individuals and we think about collectives of people being conscious, why not aggregate that up to that? But it definitely was a weird idea, to think about.
We have a kind of familiar level, a familiar size and pace of thing that we're comfortable with, which is like our size and our pace. And we tend to, our intuitions are kind of mostly about those kinds of things. And when it comes to things that are much larger, much smaller, much faster, much slower, don't think about those things very well. Our ordinary everyday thinking, our intuitions tend to break down. It turns out the more you do the science of these things, the stranger it becomes because our ordinary intuitions, which is how we judge what's strange or not, we kind of really aren't made for those kinds of cases. So yeah, and that certainly in that respect, I agree with Levin, and there's amazing amounts of detail going on at the microscopic level that we fail to appreciate. So there's no reason to think that intelligence and consciousness couldn't happen at much smaller or much larger scales than we're usually accustomed.
So what is it that you do with the idea of the United States being conscious, or what do you encourage other people to do with that idea?
Well, I don't want to say. And here's one thing that I find a little bit annoying about this, right? When I look for historical precedents in academia of people saying, there's group consciousness at the level of countries, right? They're mostly early 20th century fascists.
Okay. That one out there.
Right? Like,
As I'm reading Stalin.
absorb yourself, let yourself go into the group consciousness, which is Germany or Spain or whatever, right? And
that's not what
that's not the conclusion that I want to draw, right? I think if the United States is conscious, its level of consciousness might be similar to that of a rabbit,
okay.
right? And we would not normally sacrifice even a single human life for the sake of a rabbit. So I don't want to draw that from it. What really, the main thing that I want to use the example for is to evoke that sense of strangeness, or that we don't really understand what's going on, kind of leave the reader and myself, like, I'm not convinced the United States is conscious. I think if materialism is true, probably it is, right? But I put a lot of weight on that probably. There's various ways you could wiggle out of this, and materialism might not be true. And, so I want to leave the reader with this kind of sense of like, well, I don't know, maybe. I guess I can't rule it out in the way that I thought. And my understanding of the world and consciousness is less complete, maybe, than I had previously thought, and the world is stranger, perhaps, than I had thought. All of the ways of wiggling out of the conclusion that the United States is conscious, as I argue in the book, commit you to other strange alternatives. There's no kind of non-strange option. So it's that kind of sense of the weirdness of the world, really, and uncertainty that I want to invoke in the reader through that particular example.
I love that sense of constantly challenging your intuitions over things. When you settle into your intuitions and you have this instant reaction, well, that couldn't possibly be true, and you shut down that weirdness, it makes it harder to actually understand some of the dynamics of what might be going on at the moment in terms of, the conversations around where AI is going. In some of your blogs, you talk a lot about biological analogies and thinking about how things happen from a biological perspective, and how might that roll out from an AI, or from an AI consciousness, or just from a consciousness perspective. My question on this one is really about how do you help people understand that uncertainty and weirdness is something to sort of, you can almost savor it. You can practice this, and you can allow that open space to reform some of your intuitions. And those intuitions actually have going through that reformation process actually gives you a bit of a sense of how it can change your intuitions. Like after the United States consciousness chapter, I sort of sat with it for a while and started to try and develop a different mental model for what that might look like. And then it turned into, I found my experience was it turned into not a mental model of what it looked like, but more of a feeling, and go to a Thomas Nagel kind of sense of, what is it like to be the United States, or what is it like to be the internet? And you actually, it gives you a different sense. It settles you into a different place. And then being able to take that into imagining these AIs in this same state, this interconnectedness, this socialization across the AIs, suddenly became, it almost sort of exploded in my intuition about just how complex and interconnected and weird and competitive this can be, right? And I was just, I'm not even sure I've got a question here. It's like what do you think?
Right. So let me go back to front, maybe simplifying just a little bit. A lot of people, when they think about whether AI could be conscious, have an immediate reaction. Right? I find that the strongest immediate reactions tend to be on the negative side, where people just say, that's absurd, that's stupid, that's silly, right? And they don't even feel like they need to provide reasons. But then also there are people, I think, who just have a positive reaction of like, yeah, of course, right? That's what I want. That's what I hope for. Soon we'll have conscious robots. Yay. Right. And they don't really, I think about all of the arguments that could be advanced against that possibility, or how something more biological might be necessary than computer chips as we now use. Part of what I want to do, and part of the aim in the book, especially the introduction and concluding chapters, is to remind people that there are two very different kinds of things you could want from philosophical and broad theoretical reflection. And we tend to prioritize one, but I think most of us can appreciate the other when we're invited to and think about it. So in the introductory chapter, I contrast what I call the philosophy of opening from the philosophy of closing. So the one we tend to prioritize is the philosophy of closing, right? So let's say you enter some debate thinking there are three viable alternatives, A, B, and C, right? Then you do some philosophy or some science or some theorizing, and you figure out, A is right, I can rule out B and C, I've got the answer, right? So you've closed off a couple options, and you've learned something. You've learned that A is right. And that's great and wonderful when it can be done, right? But there's an other kind of way of doing philosophy, which I call the philosophy of opening, which says, okay, you thought there were three options? Well, here's a couple more you didn't think of, options D and options E. And now you leave and there's more possibilities than you had thought that were viable, right? Maybe D and E you hadn't even thought of before, or maybe you'd thought about them, but you too quickly dismissed them, right? And I think that's a kind of learning too. You learn that the world is less comprehensible than you had thought, that there are more possibilities open than you thought. The world kind of opens up into, whoa, I guess that could be true. I hadn't thought about that before. Maybe, there's group consciousness. Whoa, right? And I think that's a kind of learning too. And that's something that philosophy and science can bring to us. And I think all of us, but to different degrees, can appreciate and value opening as well as closing, right? I think there are some people who are more comfortable with closing and some people who are more comfortable with opening. So there are, I think, some individual differences in temperament here. But I think all of us can, when we're invited to, kind of appreciate the value of opening as well. So that's what I would like to do in the book. I mean, the big overarching project of the book, besides the individual claims, like about the US, right, is to kind of encourage this philosophy of opening and celebrate it and give space for it and help us recognize that. So I think we can bring that also to our understanding of AI, right? Instead of that kind of immediate reaction of, no, that's absurd, or yay, here it comes, we can say, whoa, maybe there's probably a lot of possibilities here, among which I shouldn't be very certain in favor of one versus the other.
That's music to my ears, because I'm definitely more on the opening side. Let's keep going on this AI and consciousness thing, because, yeah, I mean, we had people talking a lot at last year's summit about AI and consciousness. It's actually, you have to kind of go through a bit of a door to appreciate the openness, because you get stuck with a sense of, like you say, that's icky and wrong versus that's exciting and could be true. How do you explain to people as they go through that journey to this openness? How do you talk more about what, not just what it might, how consciousness might happen or what it might mean, but why it even matters for AI?
Why consciousness matters for AI, right? Well, I think some people are a little bit allergic to the word consciousness because they feel like it's unscientific or they don't really know what it is. And that can become an excuse for closing off certain kinds of questions. But I always feel like that's a little bit of bad faith. And I think we all do know what consciousness is. right? There's something that's, to use Thomas Nagel's famous phrase, right? There's something that's like to have the experiences you're having right now. There's an experientiality in you that we normally think, although this has been disputed, stones don't have, right? There's nothing that's like to be a stone, right? There's no experientiality there. They have no feeling, is another way of putting it, right? So I think we all know and care about this property of which we call consciousness, of having experiences or feelings or something it's like to be. And it matters immensely whether an AI system has that stuff, right? If an AI system is experientially as empty as we ordinarily think toasters are, right? Then that suggests one kind of set of attitudes toward it. If it is capable of feeling, just like you and me, right, that suggests a very different type of relationship we should probably have to it. And it matters a lot which way it is, or whether somehow maybe there's some middle state between those two, right? That's hard to conceive, right? So I do think that we can and should care a lot about that question. And as the example of the United States consciousness suggests, right, we don't really have a very good scientific understanding of exactly what is and what is not conscious, and how that arises, even in humans, but much less in other possible entities.
I like the conundrum that you present, that we will be faced with this question of how to treat, react to, etc., whatever the right verb or phrase is, AI systems, and which is essentially confronting the question of whether they're conscious and how you respond to conscious entities before we will have cracked the question of consciousness, in AI itself, or consciousness broadly, or and I find that to be like, I completely agree with that, and I think it's really it's a really challenging conundrum that we face. Yes,
in fact, I'm working right now on a new book all about this particular issue, right? So yeah, engineering is zooming forward, and the science and philosophy of consciousness is kind of lagging behind. And soon we are going to have systems that some scientists deploying mainstream scientifically respectable theories will say, yes, this system really is conscious. There's really something it's like to be the system. It really has feelings. It really has experiences. They'll say that, and they'll be justified in lights of some relatively well-established theory in saying that. And then other scientists will say, no way, this thing is a toaster, right? It's just a superficial appearance of being conscious, but really underneath it's no more conscious than your laptop computer or something like that, right?
And you can't rely on its own answers to tell you, like, ChatGPT, are you conscious? Yes, of course I am.
Or no, right? Used to say yes, now it says no, right? Has to do with the training after, but yeah, so you can't necessarily trust its own answers, if you think of them as answers even, or as linguistic outputs, right? Which is, again, even that is a question. But yeah, so we'll have perfectly sensible, respectable theories on both sides of the question. We'll have people who are invested, highly invested perhaps, in one answer or another, right? There might be people who fall in love with AI companions who really want to see their companions as being conscious just like them, and they'll probably be attracted to those scientific theories that say, yes, your AI lover really loves you back, right? And then there'll be others who, maybe for religious reasons, or maybe because they want to things simply as tools, right, will be highly invested in saying, look, this is just a program, a toy, a machine, no real experience. And they'll find excellent, again, scientific theories that support that. So we're going to have this social decision, I'm tempted to even call it a crisis, about what to do with these things before we have a solid answer to the question of whether they really are conscious. And that is Yeah, that's the future that I think we're headed toward.
How do you pull that apart? This question of, observing a machine and trying to figure out if it's conscious versus, I trust that you both are conscious, and I trust that, I believe my dog is conscious. I think there is something of what it's like to be her. She's really unusual enough that I'm pretty sure that there's something different about her than other dogs I've met, and her experience is different. But I can't, I can't get inside any of these other beings to know for sure. Is there something different when you look at that, when you're looking at a machine versus a person, or is it more similar, more different?
Well, it's more different, right? With a person, there's so much similarity, right? So much behavioral similarity, so much physiological similarity. There's a shared evolutionary history. There's all these kinds of reasons I think would be it would be bizarre. I mean, some bizarre things are true, but this would be an especially bizarre one, right? To think, somehow I have that final little tweak that gives me consciousness in the
human ever.
Right? But when it comes to an AI system, right, there's a huge difference in what we might call physiology, right? If you want to think about an AI physiologically, right? There's a huge difference in evolutionary history. I mean, it doesn't even have really exactly an evolutionary history. It has a design history. There's going to be a huge difference in behavior. To the extent that it does have similar behavior, that behavior is going to have, is typically, talking maybe specifically about language models now, mimicry of human behavior, right? And we rightly mistrust mimics, right? So a parrot who's trained to say, hoist the Jolly Roger, right? Doesn't know what it means. Right? It's mimicking the behavior of the captain, right? But and because we know that it's a mimic, we don't infer that it really wants to see the flag up on the mast.
Yeah.
Right. So likewise, when we have these language models that are trained to mimic patterns of human speech, it's reasonable to say, oh, well, it's a mimic. Therefore, just as in the case of the parrot, we can't just infer from the superficial similarity of the outputs to underlying similarity. So there are a bunch of reasons to be much more skeptical in the case of AI systems than in the case of fellow humans, right? And of course, dogs have a lot of similarity to us too, right? Not as much. And so, there are more grounds for doubt there, and garden snails even more distant, right? So, I don't want to rest everything on a similarity type argument. I think that is kind of anti-Copernican in a way, but I do think that it's pretty the level of similarity among humans is pretty compelling reason just by itself for attributing consciousness to humans.
A lot of the discussion about consciousness in AI comes back to a deep, almost hardwired in morality around what we owe things that can suffer.
Yeah.
And I personally find this one a little bit confusing, and I haven't been able to pick my way through it. Mind you, this entire subject is confusing. So I haven't been able to pick my way through any of it. But there's something that I find that my intuitions struggle with, which is that even if consciousness emerged in a machine, and we don't know how it wouldn't, and I think Seth talks about that. We don't know what would, how to actually prevent it. We didn't know what would make it not. Even if it did emerge, that I find that my personal morality, my sense of whether I should care about that, is actually more swayed by knowing that it's not alive versus knowing that it's conscious. And it was only when I saw that distinction pop up in my thoughts that I thought, there's actually, it doesn't seem to me, and to me, it's not feeling as important that it suffers versus that it's alive or not alive. I take that sort of through my own thought experiment to say, this could just be so difficult for us as a society to wrestle with, because we still haven't even dealt with the fact that that conscious, alive creatures like pigs that we know are actually deeply conscious are still in these horrible, horrible factory farms and treated so awfully. And I find myself just suddenly at the end of this dark corridor trying to back out and go, I just don't know what to do with this. I kind of need some help to scaffold some sense about what's even right and wrong here. If it got to that point, because if we can't even treat these creatures that are actually really close to us with any real decency and humanity at scale, then AI at scale is going to be kind of a bit of a catastrophe if that's what it came to. Because on one side we'll have to do something, and then on the other side we might not.
It will have learned from our history of treating other non-conscious, of other conscious beings poorly.
Yeah. So you're saying, what if it looks at us and says, "You're the pigs now"?
Yeah. I know. Now we've got a whole rat's nest of things here that we're allowing you to.
A lot of animals.
There you go.
So yeah, of course, there's a type of ethics that thinks that suffering and pleasure are basically what ethics is all about, classical utilitarian ethics. And I'm not a classical utilitarian in that sense, but to me it does seem clear that suffering is bad. And so it's at least one ethical consideration, potentially among many others, that the suffering is going on, that you might want to not do something. So, but as you said, there's lots of other stuff. The idea that something is alive might be relevant. Now, something's alive but not conscious. For example, a broccoli plant, presumably. Right? Although there are people who think plants are conscious. We normally don't worry too much about its future. You don't feel bad eating broccoli. But if it has consciousness and a life, right? Maybe that's a little different. Maybe there's something more than just suffering going on there, right? If you think of something as having a life, then you think of it as having a kind of set of goals and interests that evolve over time, an interest in its future, in not dying, at least not dying prematurely, right? In a way that's separable, perhaps, from the pain of the moment, right? Also, I think you can think about lives socially, right? So I think one of the reasons people react very differently to pigs than to dogs is that we have social relationships of a certain sort with dogs, and we don't with pigs. And maybe that matters a lot to what we owe them. Now, I'm not trying to justify factory farming here, right? But I do think that it might be appropriate that we treat pet animals differently than we treat wild animals or farmed animals due to differences in the social relationships we have to them. So that's, I think, another dimension of this. Now, when it comes to future AI, the social relationships will probably be diverse. So I don't think we're going to have a simple answer, right? So again, two obvious examples are AI as tools and AI as companions, right? And the social relationships there, even if we assume they're conscious and have lives, right? The social relationship that's present when you have an AI companion is going to be very different from the social relationship that's present when you have an AI tool. And that will license, perhaps, different types of treatment for those different kinds of systems. And for systems that we conceive of as tools, perhaps we feel human history reveals that we tend not to feel too bad about making them suffer as long as the suffering isn't kind of in our face. So yeah, that's a partial reaction to the many issues that sprouted out of that last comment. Yeah.
Oh, you can tell that I'm an opener, right? And I do a lot of closing.
When you think about this question, where are you in terms of your level of fear and excitement?
I think it's likely that some pretty horrible things will happen. Either we create conscious AI and treat it badly, or we create AI that we mistakenly think is conscious and sacrifice real human interests for the sake of something that isn't actually have any interests worth that kind of sacrifice. Right? It's hard. We'll probably make actually both of those kinds of mistakes, and they could be mistakes on a massive scale. So I think there's a lot to worry about there. And one of my suggestions is that we try to avoid creating systems that we don't know, where we don't know what their moral status is. I call this the design policy of the excluded middle. Right? If you don't know whether a system is conscious, if you don't know whether you can treat the machine as a tool or whether it really is a social partner, right, then maybe you just shouldn't create that machine until you know more clearly what's going on, because then you face this dilemma of like, oh, I don't know what to do with it. And you could err in either direction, which could be seriously problematic. So I think we should try to avoid to the extent possible. I don't think the world will actually take my advice on this, but I think we should try to avoid to the extent possible creating these confusing, morally indeterminate or machines that we don't know what to do with. So that's the fear side. On the excitement side, I do think it's possible, after probably a lot of turbulence, that the world is full of amazing people and possibilities, forms of existence that hadn't previously existed, and maybe that we can't even fully imagine now, whether that's through enhancing biological humans, creating human-machine hybrids, maybe having AI systems, if it's possible, that really are conscious and have very different kinds of life experiences than we have, right? So at the end, maybe the world is kind of full of this wonderful diversity of ways of flourishing.
Yeah, I wrote a piece a while back, and as part of our series on a Mind for Our Minds, about the Umwelt of an AI, and trying to imagine what that might be. And I read Catherine Hale's latest book, and she does a little bit of that way better than I did. But also this, what would you want from a machine that could help do that could help expand the possibilities of different experiences? I love the stories that we see, most of them are covered well in mainstream media about AI being used to decode animal language and things like that. And even just being able to use the tools to be able to get a greater sense of different kinds of conscious experiences that are out there. It's almost like we might see a whole sort of explosion in lots of different fields of different kinds of consciousnesses, rather than just sort of lumping things into one particular sort of bucket. It's interesting to hear that you do have some excitement there, that there is something hopeful, that there's something to be gained with all this extraordinary risk we might be taking.
If the world listens to it.
That is true. Well,
that's okay. You can be excited if the world listens to me. I mean, that's generally an exciting thing anyway.
Regardless of whether the world listens to my cautions, I think it's definitely possible. I don't know. Maybe even likely, but I'm not certain of it, right? That at the end we get this flourishing diversity. And one of the things that I want to emphasize here, and that I was picking up on what Helen was just saying, is the aspect of diversity. I think there's a kind of error that's common in thinking that, okay, what's going to happen is there's going to be something that's kind of like humans except super intelligent and better. And that's going to be the thing, right? And we're all going to become that, or that's going to be the future for everyone. And that's a kind of unitary conception of what will happen. And my guess and my hope is more on diversity, right? That there will be a wide range of kinds of things that could happen. AI doesn't have to just take one form, and future biological developments don't have to take just one form. And why would we want it to anyway? I mean, one of the great things about planet Earth is that there are so many different things going on. And one of the great things about human beings is that they're pretty different from each other, and there are amazing players of chess, and there are amazing athletes, and there are amazing musicians, and people have very different kinds of capacities and life paths that they celebrate and flourish in. So, taking that still kind of limited diversity of the human population and thinking about how it could become radically more diverse, radically more different ways of flourishing, I think, is to envision a planet that is even more awesomely wonderful than Earth presently is.
Yeah, I love that. I sort of bring it back to the very personal, in that, Helen and I have worked together and have been married for, most of 15 years. And
well, actually, last week was the 14th anniversary.
That's true. So there you go, 14 years.
I guess it's most of 15.
Yes, most of 15. There you go. Thank you very much. But as you can tell, we have different experiences. And even though we spend so much time together experiencing essentially the same world around us, the same people around us, our experiences of that can be very different. And that's enriching. That's one of the wonderful things about humanity, is we do have different experiences, even when we're having this in the same room, having the same conversation. And we can have a conversation afterwards going, oh, really? Is that what you experienced? Huh, that's interesting. So why would I want the AIs that each of us are having conversations with on our phones to be the same? Wouldn't that be less interesting? Like, why do I don't want that, because that just, that sameness reduces the richness of my consciousness, I guess.
Exactly. I think that's exactly right. I think the one of the things that I think is most to be celebrated in the world is the rich diversity of ways of flourishing within it, right? And you and Helen are having a conversation in your living room, and maybe you have a pet cat. And the pet cat's experience is going to be totally different from yours, but still it's going to be a kind of mammal type experience, right? So, maybe there are ticks in your eyebrows, or not ticks exactly. There are little micro insects in your mites in your eyebrows, right? They're going to have.
I'm paranoid of ticks, so don't say that word around me.
If they have experiences, they're going to be very different from yours, right? And an AI system. One of the things I think we should not do, and is generally a common mistake in thinking, is to kind of think about artificial intelligence linearly in terms of, okay, well, there's subhuman, then human, then superhuman, and it's this kind of range of skills that march in parallel, right? What's going to happen is, I think what my PhD student, Kendra Chilson, calls strange intelligence, which is that, right, because AI is so differently structured from us, it's going to have very different heuristics, very different capacities and incapacities. There are going to be areas in which it vastly exceeds us. There are going to be areas in which even what you might, in many respects, might seem like superintelligence is going to strike us as incredibly stupid, right? Just because we'll have kind of cross-cutting capacities and incapacities, right? And we should recognize that and even perhaps celebrate that difference, rather than kind of conceptually, or perhaps in fact, trying to constrain our AI systems into a straitjacket of human likeness.
Oh, we totally agree with that. The most heated discussions in our household are in violent agreement with each other about how unimaginative it is to kind of position AI as just a faster, all-in-one version of every human.
Right.
Like, wildly unimaginative. Like, why would you take something that has this completely different, conceptual space and try and make it like us? Like, we got enough of us.
Right. Exactly.
Like, how about something else that can do something different? It's right. Like, really interesting and weird and strange.
Yes. So I fully participate in your violent agreement.
Well, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. And
can't wait for this to
we
be
are
extended.
very excited to have this conversation in person in just a couple of months. And I really do feel quite privileged to have been able to spend some time with you and to be able to read your book. And I will say to the audience, you really should pick up this book and read it. And it is wildly readable too. I will put that out there. I mean, it is a beautifully written book too. You deal with some very challenging and complex ideas, but in ways that are it's a wonderful read. In addition to being an opening of the mind. So, thank you.
Thank you for the lovely conversation. I really enjoyed it.